Welcome to the introduction to Limit Omaha 8 or better in 10 minutes or less, brought to you by rec.poker. So what is Omaha 8? It's an Omaha game, meaning you get 4 whole cards and 5 court cards on the board, 3 in the flop, 1 on the turn, 1 on the river, just like Hold'em. And you must use exactly 2 cards from your hand and 3 cards from the board. The blinds, it's a game played with blinds. There are 2 blinds, a small blind and a big blind. It's also a limit game. So there is a small bet that's the same size as the big blind, and it's used in the pre-flop and flop betting rounds. Then the bet size is doubled to the big bet that's used on the turn and river betting rounds. Raises are capped at 4 or 5 bets, depending upon the site or the room. So look at your local rules to see what that particular site or room does. It's also a high-low game, meaning that it's a split pot game. The high hand will win half the pot, and the low hand will win the other half of the pot, generally speaking. It's 8 or better to qualify for the low, meaning if you have a 9 high-low or worse, you do not qualify to win the low portion of the hand. If no player seeing the showdown has a qualifying low of 8 or better, then the high hand will scoop the entire pot. For the low, straights and flushes will not count against you, making the best possible low hand 5, 4, 3, deuce, ace. Now let's go through some example hands to get used to how you read the board with your hand. So with this board of all spades, what is the nuts for the hand? Well, the best possible hand is going to be the 5 and 6 of spades. Notice that you have to have both the 5 and 6 because you have to play 2 cards from your hand, making the 6 high straight flush. What does the hand of 3 aces and a king make with this board? Well, you don't have a flush because you have no spades in your hand, and you have to use 2 cards from your hand. You also do not have quads because you cannot use all 3 aces from your hand. You can only use 2 of them. Therefore, you have trip aces with the 8 and 4 kicker. For the low hand, what's the best possible low with this particular hand? Well, the best possible low is going to be a 5 high low at the wheel, 5, 4, 3, deuce, ace. That's with a 5 and then either a 4 or a 3 or a deuce. They could also have an ace, but given that you have all 3 aces locked up, they can't have that. There are no aces remaining in the deck. So what is your low hand? Well, this is a bit of a quick trick question because you do not have a qualifying low. You're only playing for the high on that particular board. Let's go through another example. So with this board, what is the best possible high hand? Well, in this case, it's also going to be a straight flush with a 3 and a 5 of spades. There's lots of straights possible and lots of flushes possible, but the 5, 3 of spades will give you the only straight flush possible. And then what do you have for a hand? Well, you have trip aces again. You don't have a full house because you can't also use the deuce to make a full house. You have trip aces. Now let's look at the low hand. What's the best possible low hand? What is the nuts? Well, a 3 and a 5 will make it the wheel for a 5, 4, 3, deuce, ace, making the nuts. And what do you have? Well, you have what's known as a live 3. So you are playing 8, 4, 3, deuce, ace, using your 3 and either a deuce or an ace from your hand. And this is the last example. So with this hand, what is the best possible high hand? The best possible high hand would be quad eights. Anyone who has the remaining 2 8s in the deck would have quad eights, making it the best possible hand on this board. What do you have? You actually have the second nuts on this hand. You have a full house, aces full of eights. And for the low, what are the nuts for the low hand? Well, this is a bit of a trick question because there is no low possible. Because only 2 cards on the board, the ace and the 8, are 8 or better, no one can possibly have a low. Now let's go through an example hand and see how the action plays out. In this hand, Doyle is in the small blind with 100 chips, and Maria is in the big blind with 200 chips. Steve is under the gun with ace, ace, deuce, 3, double suited, a very good Omaha 8 hand. So Steve elects to raise to 400 chips. Jim folds. Chris calls the 400. Taylor folds. Rob elects to call as well. Meanwhile, Phil and Vanessa both fold. And then John decides to call as well. Now actions on the small blind Doyle. He decides to fold, surrendering his small blind of 100 chips. Now actions on Maria. She 3-bets to 600 chips. Action comes back to Steve now. He decides to 4-bet to 800 chips. Chris has now had enough and decides to fold. Rob also waves the white flag, deciding to fold. And John can't get enough punishment and decides to call. Action now comes back to Maria. Maria elects to cap the betting round, 5-betting to 1,000 chips. No more raising is possible in this hand, or in this betting round. Steve now calls, and John calls as well. Dealer collects the chips into the pot, and we move on to the turn, or onto the flop rather, with 3,900 chips in the pot. The flop is dealt, and it comes Jack, Ace 4, and Maria will be first to act. She decides to bet 200 chips, the only size she can bet. John decides to raise, or Steve decides to raise to 400. John then decides to call. Maria then 3-bets to 600 chips. Steve 4-bets to 800. And John now gives up, folding. Maria at this point elects to just call. Dealer collects all of the chips into the pot, and we move on to the turn with 5,900 chips in the pot. Maria is first to act. Well, first we see the turn card. It is the King of Diamonds. Now Maria is first to act. She decides to check. Steve bets 400 chips. Maria raises to 800. Steve, noticing that the flush is possible, elects to just call. The dealer collects the chips into the pot, and we move on to the river with 7,500 chips in the pot. The river card is dealt. It is the 7 of spades. This makes lows now possible. Maria bets 400 chips. Steve opts to call the 400. The dealer then collects the chips into the pot. We have 8,300 chips in the pot, and we move on to showdown. Now, the high hand will win half the pot, and the low hand will win the other half. Because we're theoretically playing with only 100 chip 100 chips is our lowest denomination, the high hand will get the extra chip. So 4,200 for the high half of the pot, 4,100 for the low half. And for the high hand is going to be the ace high flush. So Maria has the nut flush and will take down the high half of the pot. For the low half, the nuts is the 7-4 3 deuce ace. Both Maria and Steve have the same hand. Therefore, the low hand side of the pot is also going to be chopped. However, because there's only 100 chips is the lowest denomination, the extra chip will go to the first person past the dealer. Maria gets 2,100 in chips and Steve gets 2,000 in chips. This is what's known as being quartered, when you only get a quarter of the pot. Additional tips. The bets add up, especially the big bets on the turn and the river. So even though it's limit, you do need to be careful about when you put chips in the pot. Limping pre-flop can be a good strategy, given that this is a game of draws and redraws. And until you see the flop, you don't know what type of hand, how your hand will connect with the board. In general, you want to avoid hands with 8s or 9s. They make the worst possible low hands, and they aren't making your highest straights either. And you want to play hands with good scoop potential. Generally, this means playing for the low and trying to back into the high. So you play to get a decent low and hopefully get a straight to go with it, or maybe trips or something to win the high portion of the hand. You can join us playing in our home game on PokerStars. We play the first Wednesday of every month, No Limit Hold'em, and the second Wednesday of every month is mixed games. Check out rec.poker/homegame for all of the information on how to join. Hope to see you at the tables.